we had to reach out in some way in order to find ourselves. And the butterflies that people in the queer community is beautiful.
Juliet Rutter is the board secretary with Umpqua Valley Rainbow Collective. The group puts together pride events and other LGBTQ-focused activities in Oregon's Douglas County.
We have to go through that struggle in order to find ourselves. And while I don't think that we should have to do that, I think that it is still something that should be revered and respected and loved.
They explained that the group came together to create safe spaces for queer people. Last year, the group put on its first Pride Festival at the Douglas County Fairgrounds. Rutter told me the collective chose that location for a very specific reason.
It can be a space that we can enclose so people don't need to be mulling about with protesters literally right behind them. The protesters get to be outside of the event. So it's a much more exclusive thing that people can feel safer at, and less like they need to defend their existence every 2 seconds while also trying to celebrate themselves. We're trying to help them to not have to do that.
June is officially Pride Month, but queer celebrations spill over into July. Portland Pride is this weekend. And of course, queer visibility shouldn't be limited to one month of the year. It's important all the time.
I really love, actually, how much more visibility is on rural spaces. This isn't the only place that I've heard of where rural areas are starting to get more attention. And that really gives me hope.
I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Pride is about celebrating queer communities, and it's also a chance to learn about queer history. Today, we're going to bring you 2 intergenerational conversations about the importance of history and combating queer erasure with friendship and resilience. Eugene has been known for decades as a very lesbian-friendly city. From the 1960s through the 1990s, lesbians traveled from across the U.S. to Eugene, Oregon, many in Volkswagen buses. In fact, so many lesbians made their way to Eugene and began building lesbian collective businesses and group houses that it became known as the lesbian Mecca.
I'm Enid Lufton, and right now, I think I'm a historic lesbian, I realize, which is amazing. I'm 72 years old, which is also amazing. Was originally from Ohio and came here in 1977 to Eugene. Very, very involved in the lesbian community all that time.
OPB Weekend Edition host Lillian Kerbake recorded a really fascinating conversation between Enid and Shayna Meltzer, who is 51 years younger than her.
My name is Shayna Meltzer. I use she, they pronouns. I'm 21 years old. I grew up in San Diego, California, and now I go to the University of Oregon.
Enid and Shayna were both raised Jewish, and they were both involved in the Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project. They've become good friends.
I would call Enid my queer grandma, and we get dinners, and it is very lovely and very special.
Actually, I was looking for some young bodies to help me with a garage sale like a year ago. But over the year, then we just would spend time together and just talk and learn about each other, and it's just amazing.
Very special. I didn't really know anything about other generations in terms of queerness or anything about that. You know, I knew a little bit of history, but I didn't have people in my life. And I think that as I was kind of coming into my own identity and exploring who I was, who I wanted to be, being able to have someone from an older generation who's been there and can talk through that with me has been a really powerful experience.
And for me, it never occurred to me that younger people would be at all interested in me as an old person. And it just surprises me how they're really interested in, what my life was like and what it is like now. And and that they honor that. And I just never expected that. I usually thought that young people didn't really pay much attention to older people. I guess when I was young, I didn't. But so it's been really refreshing, and it's been really, it's just been really nice to, talk about what our lives are like and, hopefully be some kind of role model, but also they're such role models to me too. Talking with Shayna and other younger people, I really, I'm in awe of like what they're having to deal with. And also, they also, are looking for ways to connect and seeing through the project what we had, the community that we built in the 70s and 80s, and, how there isn't something exactly like that now.
I think that, being exposed to social media at such a young age, there's suddenly all of these options and all of these things, and do you have to know, and how do you figure it out? I think that sometimes my generation likes to label. I think there is really that like desire to have like your identities and what those are, and then there's so many different ones.
Being queer is not at all like it was when, I was first coming out. And, I know a lot of people my age still have a hard time using the word queer. I'm very comfortable with it because it really incorporates, so many different things, that the possibilities that we have. And so and then coming out as a lesbian, especially through feminism, really realizing that the patriarchy was keeping us down and finding ways for women and lesbians to be able to create our own space and our own way of living. And I think it's gone beyond that now because there's more than just the binary, and there's more than, when I was, coming out, it was pretty much like you figure out, are you gay or straight? Maybe are you butch or femme, although that was starting to ebb a little bit. But now there's so many things that you have to look at to figure out who am I, and those things are changing all the time. And I think it was, it was maybe a lot simpler for us, even though there were, we really had to fight, and there was a lot of prejudice, but we also, it was easier for us to find our direction and move towards it, I guess. I grew up with crushes on my girlfriends all the time, and I was madly in love with my best friend in high school. And there was some physical stuff that happened, but we never acknowledged, what was going on. I was in college and I was taking a psychology class, and we were on the chapter on deviant behavior, which was drug addiction, prostitution, and homosexuality. And I remember walking out of class, and my friend was had the class in the same building after me, and I saw her there, and it was like, I freaked out. It's like, that can't be me. That can't be me. Homosexuality was still considered a disease at that time. And so people always ask me, talk about coming out to their family and friends and stuff. I never sat down with anybody and said, oh, I'm gay, I just was myself, and people figured it out, and it was okay. And fortunately, my parents were very accepting and, loving about it, so.
There was a sense of shame for me when I was first kind of exploring that part of my identity. And kind of similar to you in high school, I went on a date with a girl and then just kind of was like, actually, that was just a practice. That doesn't mean anything, And then it wasn't until COVID, my senior year, where I was spending all of this time alone in my room and a lot of time on social media. And I don't know, I was able to kind of reflect on myself a little bit more. So I first came out to a friend around that time, and it was hard. I was crying, and she was very supportive. And I don't really know where that shame kind of came from. It didn't come from my family. And my parents,
well, it could have come from society, the world.
Yes, you're right. There maybe were some other messages out there emphasizing those things. Yeah, absolutely. And my parents have always been so you love who you love. And even so, it was more, I wanted to tell them when I had someone to tell them about. I don't know why that's what it was for me. A couple months ago, they were up to visit me, and we were at dinner, and they were asking me about all the work that I've been able to do with this Eugene Lesbian Oral History Project, because it's become my favorite thing ever. And my dad kind of said something like, well, you haven't told us that there's any other reason that you're interested in that. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I will tell you. And that was kind of, I officially came out.
Because I never came out to my family or anybody else, actually. I'm curious, it's like, how do you say it? What do you say? How do you communicate it? What does it mean,
Yeah, it was kind of hard because I don't feel like I am defined by any one label. And then once I'm like putting something out there, then I feel like that becomes it, right? Like that's how people see me, or like that's what I am. So finding the right words to express that part of my identity was challenging. And at first I think they were kind of like bummed that I hadn't told them sooner. So I kind of had to reassure them, like, it's not because of you, you've been incredible always. It was more just my own journey coming to like wanting to talk about that part of myself.
But I think part of it is that people, especially younger people, are realizing, there's lots of things that are okay. And they're just experiencing it. It doesn't mean that they're, like a raging dyke like I was, but, that they,
But they could be.
Well,
they can be.
We could only, we're, as a community, are constantly redefining ourselves and moving in different directions, and change is always hard. But when it comes down to it, people should be what they want to be and who they want to be. And, I always felt like, as far as like sexuality, even, when I was first coming out, even, I really felt, honestly, that there was a spectrum, and that people were in different places in it, and most people should be in the middle. And I felt like I was definitely at one end, and that's, I've always felt that way. Not that I always felt comfortable being around people at different places in that spectrum, but I knew that it seemed like that was the ideal.
And I think that highlights like a real barrier that sometimes exists between the younger and older generation, because I think with two different experiences and two different dialogues around what does it mean to be queer and different ideas about sexual identity and gender identity, I think sometimes it's really hard for like my generation, who cancel culture is really big. I think sometimes there's that like kind of shut off because they see it as like, oh, well, you're being disrespectful, or you're not like being open to it. And then it kind of doesn't allow maybe those conversations to happen. So I think that's a really big thing that we can try to push through, is being able to have conversations like past, the different vocabulary we use and the different definitions we use.
Especially in retrospect, realizing that the whole AIDS crisis, which was horrible, but the positive thing out of it is got us all to work together. Lesbians were there helping the gay men, and the allies coming out. And so it really did change. It really moved forward the gay rights movement, in a kind of sad way.
I think I can mostly only speak from, my own experience and context. But I think that I would want your generation to know that we're really proud of the history and seeing how far queer people have come. And like, I get to live the way that I live now because of things that your generation did. And I just hope that in the future there's a lot more dialogue between our two generations, because I think that there's no need to reinvent a wheel, right? Like, there's so many things that you all went through that unfortunately, in some ways we're seeing it happen for our generation as well as yours again. So finding like being in community and working together towards just all being accepted.
Just keep doing that. I mean, there's so much more. There's so much beyond. Who knows what comes next? And, love yourself.
I think I love myself more genuinely because of the relationship I have with you, and getting to see like what my future could look like, or what existed before me. It's very meaningful to me in my life.
Thanks. And it's been so meaningful to me to have your wonderfulness in my life, because, I was going through, a major change in my life, losing my spouse of 34 years. And, to find, this new energy and love. And it's just been life-saving for me.
Coming up after a break, we'll hear another intergenerational conversation. This one is between two queer men. Looking back on the history of LGBTQ people reveals how much has changed and the challenges that queer communities still face. OPB Morning Edition host Jess Hazel recently brought together two people to reflect on this during Pride season.
So before we get started, I feel like I should get to just know you a little tiny bit. All I know is your name is Roland. My name is Paul, he, him pronouns. I'm 61, and I've been in Portland for a long time.
Nice.
How about you?
I'm Roland Mechanic, he, him pronouns as well. I'm 32.
Okay.
I've been in Portland about 10 years.
Okay.
I'm originally from Florida, so that kind of fun.
Another refugee coming here.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Paul Arabino is the editor of a new anthology called Defining Moments: Essential Queer Stories that spans generations and locations across the Northwest. And Roland Mechanic is a comedian and improviser.
What do you hope that older people understand about your experience?
Yeah, well, I think there is this divide. You know, I don't have a lot of like older queer friends, and I wish I did, because I think understanding that we are going through a lot of the same things that you did to a very different degree, right? I think in a lot of ways it is a lot better for the youth today. But in a lot of ways, like with visibility comes a lot more violence, and you know, just being on the internet and social media. I mean, if I choose to post a video where I'm telling a story about being trans, that opens me up to so much hate.
Yeah,
and so I think that's part of like being younger. And even like I'm 32, so I'm not even on TikTok as much as the Gen Zers. But yeah, I think that's sort of just part of it, is like, okay, well, if I want to be myself and put myself out there, I might get some horrific things said to me online. And it's like, that's kind of an unfortunate part of the culture right now.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about kind of the flip side of that. What do you hope that younger people understand or take away from these stories?
What I'm finding is the depth of emotions are there, and young kids are listening, and they really appreciate the stories. And I think they appreciate the resilience that we demonstrate for them, and they want to be near that. They want to be close to that. One of our storytellers talked about a suicide attempt, and it was a very painful experience, but it also defines who that person is today. And this year, he's coming up on his 10-year anniversary, and he calls it his life celebration. It just, that story in of itself, when he reads that story, the young kids can totally relate to that.
Yeah.
And some of them have talked about suicide ideation or, you know, cutting themselves. And it's just like, wow, that still happens today. So I think I would love to see if there's a way that we can foster that. How can we support one another and maybe not so much tokenize the experiences, but see how we can be there,
Right.
cross generations for each other.
I mean, it's so important to hear about elder stories and, you know, what happened during the AIDS crisis and things like that, because I mean, I know I grew up hearing that I had a mentor who's around your age, who's a gay man in Florida, and he was super influential to me. He was my acting teacher, my first improv teacher, but he had so many friends. He lived in New York in the 80s, and he had so many friends that died. And I don't know if like the real young queers know as much about that now. And so I think it is so important just to find these ways to connect and talk to each other.
I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are about our future. So we have this history. How does that inform the future?
To be honest, it's hard right now for me to feel hopeful about the future. I don't know. Right now, it feels like a little bit of a dark time, and it's hard to see what the path forward is there. But I think it's continuing to connect in these ways. And I just know when I'm with my community, it just feels like better. And like, okay, maybe we can tell our stories together and have each other's backs. Well, I'm curious what you think about the future.
Yeah, well, I feel like we're at a rough patch politically. It's one of the reasons why I wanted this book to come out now during this election year, because I feel like there is a sense of this queer erasure. Like they don't want to know our stories.
Yeah.
Like they're banning our books, they're burning our books. They don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know. And these stories are so important. So I'm very motivated to tell these stories, because if we don't, then who does?
Yeah.
And I'm really passionate about that. And the other thing, I feel like allies have been super, super supportive on this journey, that they want to know more. They want to be able to support us in a meaningful way. It's like they want more depth too. They want to understand our struggles and our challenges so they can be better allies. So yeah, I feel hopeful, but there's still this feeling of, I feel unsettled with just like the way things are going politically, and also the separation. It's almost like we have like two different countries. But, when I was talking about allies, it made me wonder for you, because you're a different generation than I am, are you getting support from allies outside of the trans or the queer community? And what is that like for you? What's your experience like?
I am getting some support outside of the queer community, and I think it's definitely gotten better, especially living in Portland. And, I think there's sometimes a difference between people saying they're allies and having good intentions, but then when it comes down to their actions, they don't necessarily do anything. So one example of that is, like, it's a simple way to be an ally is to correct someone if someone misgenders you. But people get so scared. I can see it in their face. It's like, oh, am I doing the right thing? Should I, I don't want to overstep. And it's like, just say, hey, it's he, him,
Right.
And I think like it's this fear of doing the wrong thing. And so sometimes they don't end up doing anything. I'm sure over the years, you've seen more and more allies come to the front.
What are some of the themes that you're seeing in queer community with the stories when you're doing your own storytelling or listening to other stories, or even just like hanging out with friends? Are you coming across certain themes, some universal themes?
I would say a big theme I've noticed, at least recently in my community, is people not thinking they're queer enough. Like sort of having this idea of what it means to be a part of the LGBTQI plus community. And I can't tell you, I've had countless friends that are, well, I'm bi, but I've never actually been with a woman, and I don't think, I don't want to take up space. And I just want to say, you're all welcome. Like, there's no queer enough. I think it's just always going to be discovering who you are, and how you tell that to the world is always going to be a universal theme.
Good point.
Yeah. What about you in your book? Did you find any themes other than coming out?
Generationally, I would say that for the older of us in the book, there were probably some universal themes around safety. What would we lose? Like the alienation was huge. Like if we were discovered, we would lose our jobs, we'd lose our housing, we'd lose our school. Like we would lose so much. And then also just not having role models. We have, I believe, two older trans storytellers. One is 75 and one is 66. And to be trans at like 5 and 10 years old, but not to have a name for it, and to feel like you're the only one.
They didn't have the role models, so they kind of had to become the role models, even though they didn't necessarily sign up for that. Then, I mean, I feel like that to a much smaller degree with like being the first out trans improviser in Portland, at least that I'm aware of. Like, I did not want to be a role model, but I think if you're the first of anything, people look at you and there's sort of a spotlight on you. And that's something with queer stories. It's nice when we're able to put the spotlight on ourselves in a way that feels good, instead of just, oh, you're just, like you said, tokenizing me just because of my identity.
So it makes me think, I've noticed that when we do things like by us, for us, and I don't do this enough, but I love doing queer events for queer people and allies, obviously, but it's different.
Yeah.
At least for me, it just feels so right. It's like we're just with ourselves and we can just celebrate ourselves and we can maybe say something a little off color, but we can get away with it because it's like us.
If I know it's a room of mostly queer people, like, I can let my guard down a little bit and just kind of like breathe a little. I have a queer improv team, and when we perform together, it's just the most fun. Knowing, like, okay, we have that in common.
Yes.
Like, I feel more taken care of, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you just want to say, a certain message that resonates with you with Pride this year?
I think I'd like to maybe just reiterate, because we both talked about people not thinking that they're queer enough or that their stories are important enough. And I just want people to really like sit with that and think about what makes you think that you're not important enough to tell your story. Because I think there's probably a lot of people out there whose stories we're not hearing. If this is like a theme that we're encountering, there's probably a lot of people that are still afraid to speak out. So, yeah, I would just love to just keep hearing from young people, from old people, and keep having these conversations where we're able to realize we have a lot more in common than we thought.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Pride edition of The Evergreen. Head over to opb.org for more coverage of Pride in the Pacific Northwest. And thank you in general for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Tune in next week to hear from science reporter Jess Burns about the researchers exploring honey as a sweet solution for faster, more efficient computers. If you're here listening right now, by the way, you are part of our new podcast family. And you can help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app, including YouTube. Follow us there and, hey, tell your friends. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing. Lillian Kerbake and Jess Hazel did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And if you have a question for us, please hit us up. You can reach us by email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Happy Pride. Catch you later.